Welcome to Now in the 90s, where we look at the game releases of 30 years ago today. This week, a ninja action RPG, a cultural phenomenon gets a video game, and a new Nintendo franchise is born. Hi, I'm your host, Jared, and today is March 31st, 1993. A legendary Nintendo staple is now 30 years old. Released on March 26, 1993 for the Super Nintendo, was Star Fox. Star Fox is an on-rails shooter. Play as Fox McCloud, ace pilot, alongside the rest of his team, Falco, Peppy, and Slippy. Travel through numerous worlds and outer space, blasting everything in front of you while collecting power-ups and devastating Nova Bombs. Defeat bosses at the end of each level and potentially finding a few secret levels. Adding replayability instead of just difficulty settings, 3 courses of varying challenge are offered, each one having specific levels that could only be played within them. Star Fox was developed by Argonaut Software, who we covered just recently with their other release, King Arthur's World. This is the game that they were working on while King Arthur's World was a side project. Star Fox came to be when Argonaut Software caught the eyes of Nintendo after they proved that they could get around the Nintendo Game Boy's copyright protection. They then showed Nintendo what the most the SNES could put out in terms of graphics without any kind of custom hardware with a prototype version of Star Glider, a game Argonaut Software previously made for the Amiga. After hearing this, Nintendo said, "All right, do what you need to do." This allowed Argonaut Software to create the Super Effects chip. The Super Effects chip essentially allowed the Super NES to push out more graphical power, especially for 3D polygons, which is what allowed for Star Fox's impressive visuals. The downside being, the Super Effects chip was expensive and was going to make the game cartridge cost more. The Super Effects chip would only be used in a handful of future games, such as Dirt Trax FX, Vortex, the SNES version of Doom, and Yoshi's Island. While Argonaut Software worked on the hardware and the programming for the game, Star Fox was designed internally at Nintendo. They took care of the core gameplay, the characters, the world, and the music. It was all being done in super secret means, with some of the Argonaut Software team in Kyoto, Japan, in a building separate from the rest of Nintendo, with Shigeru Miyamoto visiting frequently to give feedback. Star Fox came out in March of 1993, and the world didn't know of its existence until just a couple of months earlier. It officially made its debut at the Winter Consumer Electronics Show in January 1993, and everyone's minds were blown. Now, in the 90s, 3D graphics were absolutely revolutionary. What was once relegated to only powerful home computers was a scarcity for home video game consoles. Only a couple were even capable of such graphics. The Sega CD could barely do it. The 3DO wouldn't be out for several months. The Sega Saturn and PlayStation were years away. For a 16-bit console, to have these kinds of graphics was impressive. This was more than just another game release for Nintendo. This was a means to show that the Super Nintendo had staying power, that it could do things that others can't. Alongside the Super Effects chip, Star Fox became a fresh marketing tool for them to use. It allowed Nintendo to fire back at primary rival Sega, whose slogan at the time of "Welcome to the next level" was directly attacked by Nintendo's advertising for Star Fox.
Witnessing a new technology. The first and only game powered by the Super FX microchip. Why go to the next level when you can go light years beyond? You are Fox McCloud in Star Fox, only for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System.
Regardless of what its success would be, the reality of Star Fox and the Super Effects chip effectively let Nintendo extend the lifespan of the Super Nintendo, even with new competition popping up. It showed that their console could keep up with what the others are doing, without silly attachments or all new hardware to pop on. You just gotta dish out a couple of extra bucks for each new Super FX game. The hype was real. Star Fox graced the cover of Electronic Gaming Monthly's March 1993 issue. Nintendo Power made it their cover for issue 47 of April 1993. Along with that, Nintendo Power ran a Star Fox comic that was included in every issue for the next 11 months, starting in February before the game even came out. To further feed into the hype, competitions were held. On the weekend of April 30th, 1993, players all over the United States could partake in the Star Fox Competition Weekend, held in various shopping malls across the nation. It featured a special edition of Star Fox, with truncated versions of the first Cornelia and Asteroid Belt levels, followed by a level found only in the competition cartridge. Players went for high scores, with top performers earning t-shirts, pins, and a raffle entry into the grand prize of a trip for 4 to London, Sydney, Paris, or Tokyo, or $15,000 cash. The competition was also held in the United Kingdom, where the game was called Star Wing, mostly so that it wouldn't get confused with an Atari 2600 game called Star Fox, and to not get confused with a German company named Star Vox. It doesn't matter. When it came out, Star Fox was an immediate hit. During the launch window, Nintendo sold an unprecedented 1.7 million cartridges, becoming the fastest selling video game launch in America at that time. Eventually, it sold a total of 4 million cartridges. For comparison, a game was considered successful if it sold like 200,000 copies. Reviews were also all over it. GamePro magazine gave it perfect scores in every category. Nintendo Power gave it a review score of a staggering 4.2 out of 5. And Electronic Gaming Monthly gave it the Game of the Month award and high scores all around. The success of Star Fox before it even came out caused Argonaut Software to immediately begin working on a sequel, Star Fox 2, which infamously would be 100% completed for the Super Nintendo, but canceled at the last minute to make way for the Nintendo 64. It was eventually leaked onto the internet in the early 2000s and officially released with the release of the Super Nintendo Mini. As for Star Fox, the crew, and its legacy, they famously skyrocketed into the gaming fandom with Star Fox 64, getting a handful of new games, and their latest release was Star Fox Zero for the Nintendo Wii U, which was released in 2016, which, as of this video, was 7 years ago. Any piece of culture that became a phenomenon in the 90s had to have a video game. Also released this week in 1993 was American Gladiators for the SNES. American Gladiators is a video game based on the television show of the same name. Play as a competitor going up against several of the American gladiators of the time. These events include that weird gauntlet where you run from station to station, shooting Nerf weapons at the giant target above the gladiator, swinging on a rope to knock the gladiator off a platform, and that one where you roll a giant hamster ball onto platforms for points, and jousting a gladiator. Earn enough points and then you can take on the final challenge of the Eliminator. American Gladiators is a TV show that began in 1989 in America. A brief description of it is that it's half a sports competition, half reality show, as regular everyday people go up against gladiators at their peak physical performance, all with cool nicknames like Zap, Laser, and Turbo. The weekly series became a smash success, garnering the same kind of water cooler talk and engagement as something like the NFL. So naturally, a video game had to be made. It was developed by GameTech, who had already produced an NES version in 1991, and a Sega Genesis version would follow a few months after this. The best way to describe the gameplay of American Gladiators is, it sucks. It's basically a collection of mini-games, most of which are played by literally button mashing as fast as you can. There's brief intros for all the gladiators in the game's intro sequence, but they don't actually appear at any time in the game itself. And the entire time, there's basically one song that plays throughout. As a kid who loved the American Gladiators and going to the rental store to see such cool guys like Nitro and Malibu on the cover, it was beyond frustrating trying to play a game that was so stupid and boring. And it's because of things like the video game that got the television show in trouble. The gladiators themselves would eventually strike. The actors behind the gladiators were not paid any kind of royalties for their likeness. So when their face started showing up on everything from action figures to lunchboxes to video games, they got upset. They weren't seeing a nickel of any of that money, which is why in the television show, new gladiators would rotate in seemingly out of nowhere. Even worse, they had their face on a bad product. The video game sucked and everyone knew it. Reviews for the game were abysmal. 17 out of 100. A 6%. Even Nintendo Power scored it of an average of a 2.9 out of 5. More sequels keep on coming though. Also released this week 30 years ago, was Super Ninja Boy for the SNES. Super Ninja Boy is a side-scrolling beat-em-up that's also an RPG. This means wandering around towns, talking to NPCs, and walking the overworld with random encounters switching to a beat-em-up style game. There's also a few boss fights where you fight with usual menu-based attacks, and the entire game is 2-player co-op. Super Ninja Boy was developed by Culture Brain and is actually the third game in the series. The original was Kung Fu Heroes for the NES, followed by Little Ninja Brothers, also for the NES, and then finally Super Ninja Boy. It stars the same characters, the same 2 heroes, and some NPCs from the previous games show up as cameos in this new SNES game. The entire game is intentionally silly, as it's more of a comedic game than something with any kind of coherent plot or overarching story. Think of it as something like Mystical Ninja starring Goemon, but with awful hit detection, choppy animation, and some real jank controls. It isn't very good and hard to recommend. As for what everyone else thought at the time, we have no idea. We could not find a single review for Super Ninja Boy through numerous gaming magazines of the time. The most there was a preview of it in Electronic Gaming Monthly issue 45. And in EGM issue 44, they previewed the Japan-only sequel to this game, but that's it. No reviews. Nobody cared. So even back then, so many games were coming out that some would just slip through the cracks. But not on our watch though. For everything else, here's Editor Dylan.
Battle Grand Prix is a top-down racing game for the SNES. Due to the perspective, it feels more like racing with toys than actual cars. So if you played with Hot Wheels or Micro Machines, you'll probably dig this one. If you only like real cars but hate racing, somehow, then Road Avenger for the Sega CD might fit that extremely niche crowd. Taking a page from Dragon's Lair, you watch a few seconds of a well-animated, yet overly compressed movie. Then a button will appear which requires you to accurately press it in a very limited time. If you don't have the reaction time of the Flash, prepare to watch the same thing you already saw until you memorize it. If you still want to play it, I recommend you skip this version, find the full movie on YouTube, and rewind it every 10 seconds or so. It'll still be a more enjoyable experience than playing this game. Who needs the power of CDs when the Genesis alone can handle animations like this? Cyborg Justice is a beat-em-up that looks cool, but I couldn't tell you how anything works. You customize your Borg and button mash until something happens. Apparently you need the manual just to figure out how to properly play, so if you rented this as a kid, then I'm sorry for bringing up memories of a wasted weekend. The last Genesis game that released this week was James Bond 007, The Duel, and it's got that licensed side-scroller run-and-gun kind of vibe going for it. Explore a handful of levels in your snazzy Bond suit with your Bond pistol, shooting some iconic Bond villains and saving all the Bond babes. But only the blonde ones, apparently. Couldn't be bothered to save even one brunette. The man clearly has a type. Maybe he likes blonde because it rhymes with Bond. Sumo Fighters is a Game Boy side-scroller starring a sumo wrestler. Fighter. The game has you sumo slapping everything in your path, breaking rocks with your bare hands, chucking foes into another time zone, loading up on carbs and upgrading stats. Bonus stages involving other forms of wrestling like thumb wrestling or arm wrestling is pretty fun, and I highly recommend you emulate it. Now, why wouldn't I recommend you buy this? A better question would be, why haven't I showed you the current value yet? But there's no time for that because we got a total of 8 games released on these 3 consoles this week in 1993. How about this? If we're going by complete approximations, frequent viewers of the show would know that Little Samson is the most expensive game we've covered so far. Around 2.5 Kid Draculas could be worth just as much. Well, about 2 Sumo Fighters could get you 1 Kid Dracula. Okay, fine. If you need to know how much a complete copy of Sumo Fighter is, then it's about 2 Color of Dinosaurs. I can't stop. This is why I don't cover the Collector's Corner. Jared, help me out here.
Thank you, Dylan. Here in the Collector's Corner, having sold millions of copies and even included with new SNES consoles, Star Fox is very common to find. It released with a suggested retail price of $59.95, and now the game itself is only $15. And with the box and manual, it's worth $70. American Gladiator sucks and should feel bad. The game alone is only worth $8, and the box and manual only brings it up to $27. Super Ninja Boy has only done adequately well. A loose copy of the cartridge goes for $25, and a complete one is worth $100. Not this week's biggest value gainer though. That would be Sumo Fighters for the Game Boy.
It's about 13 Super Ninja Boys.
And that's it for today. Next week, another Genesis Disney game, giant robots, and the adventures of the Uncola. I'm your host, Jared, and this was Now in the 90s. Thank you so much for watching Now in the 90s. I want to thank some patrons like Dark Cal X, Skizzy, and Common CJ. Please like the video and leave a comment down below, especially if you played any of these games like American Gladiators, and subscribe if you haven't already. And if you already are a subscriber, thank you so much for watching this show every single Friday. Where were you when you first played Star Fox? I remember it very clearly. I was 8 years old, over at my childhood friend's house, and my mom stopped by to drop off some rental games for us to play all night. And with that, she had Star Fox. She also rented Mario's Time Machine, and we played that one the most.